The rain was relentless that evening, drumming against the windows of Eleanor Carter's modest, time-worn house. At 78, she had grown accustomed to the solitude of her quiet life, each passing year eroding the laughter and chaos that once filled her home. The dim light of her reading lamp flickered, casting shadows across the faded photographs on the mantel, reminders of a family now scattered by time and loss. Just as she turned a page in her worn paperback, a sharp knock at the door shattered the silence. Eleanor froze, her heart quickening. It was unusual to have visitors at this hour, let alone in such dreadful weather. Gripping her shawl tightly, she shuffled toward the door, the old wood creaking beneath her slippers. Peering through the peephole, she saw two small figures, twins, no older than 10, drenched and trembling under the weight of the storm. Their identical faces were pale, their wide eyes brimming with fear and urgency. Eleanor hesitated. Why were they out here alone, and in such terrible conditions? Cautiously, she opened the door. The twins stepped forward, clutching each other's hands. The girl, her curls plastered to her face by the rain, spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, ma'am, we need to talk to you. It's about your son." Eleanor's breath caught. Her son? Her mind raced. Memories of strained phone calls and unanswered letters resurfaced, but nothing prepared her for what these children might say. "What do you mean?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling as much as her hands. The boy finally spoke, his words sending a chill through her soul. He sent us here. He said you needed to know the truth before it's too late." What truth? What could her estranged son have possibly told these children? And why did their sorrowful eyes carry a weight far beyond their years? Eleanor stepped aside, beckoning them in, her chest tightening with dread. Little did she know, the confession they were about to make would upend everything she thought she knew about her family and her life. Eleanor Carter had never expected to grow old alone. As a young woman, she had dreamt of a bustling home filled with laughter, the sound of children playing, and a husband who would stand by her through life's highs and lows. She had grown up in a small, close-knit town, where families were the heart of the community, and she'd always imagined her life would follow that same well-worn path. She met Thomas Carter when she was just 22, and he was a dashing young man, full of ambition and charm. Their romance had been a whirlwind, full of sweet gestures and promises of a bright future. They married within a year, eager to start a family of their own. Over the years, their home filled with the sounds of life, first with the arrival of their daughter Emily, and then, 5 years later, their son Ethan. But as much as Eleanor cherished the joy of motherhood, she could never have foreseen the challenges that would come with it. Emily, though lively and full of dreams, was always the easy one, a brilliant student, fiercely independent, and always the first to step up in family matters. Ethan, on the other hand, was different. He was quiet, withdrawn even, and struggled to fit in with his peers. Eleanor had always known that there was something within him that wasn't quite the same as others, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Her husband, Thomas, was a successful businessman, but he wasn't equipped for dealing with their son's emotional distance. They tried, of course. They tried everything, the best schools, therapy sessions, and even family vacations in hopes of reconnecting, but nothing seemed to bring the change they yearned for. As Ethan entered his teenage years, his behavior became more erratic. His grades slipped, He started skipping school, and the boy who once had a glimmer of hope in his eyes now seemed consumed by an inner turmoil that no one could understand. Eleanor found herself spending sleepless nights, lying awake, wondering where she'd gone wrong. The distance between mother and son grew with each passing year. Emily, who had once been a comforting presence in the family, was now in college far away. She returned only during holidays, and even then, she could sense the growing divide in their family. Thomas, unable to manage his frustration, withdrew more and more, retreating into his work. Eleanor, now dealing with the fallout of her son's rebellious phase alone, grew increasingly isolated. The phone calls with Ethan became sparse, and his visits fewer. He had moved out at 18, claiming he needed his space. It wasn't long before Eleanor stopped hearing from him altogether. Months would pass without a word. When Thomas passed away from a sudden illness 3 years ago, Eleanor had hoped it would be a wake-up call for Ethan. Perhaps the loss of his father would bring them closer. But instead, it deepened the silence. Ethan didn't come to the funeral. He didn't send a card or even a message. He was completely absent from the grief-stricken household. Eleanor never gave up hope. She told herself that one day Ethan would come back to her. Perhaps he needed time, space to grow, and figure himself out. She kept his childhood bedroom exactly the same as it had been when he left, tucked away in the back of the house, just a few steps away from hers. Every so often, she would open the door, run her fingers over the dusty toys and books, and wonder where he was, what he was doing, and if he thought about her at all. Meanwhile, Eleanor's life had become one of quiet routine. She had a small circle of friends, mostly older women from the neighborhood who would come over for tea and gossip. Their conversations often circled back to their children and grandchildren, their triumphs and their heartbreaks. Eleanor would sit in the company of her friends, smiling through the pain of missing her son, pretending that everything was fine. But in her heart, she carried the weight of his absence with her every day. Her small home was a place of comfort, though sometimes the silence within its walls was deafening. The rooms felt too big for one person, the walls too close. The memories of her life with Thomas and the children seemed to echo through the halls, haunting her in a way she had never anticipated. The day of the storm, the day the twins arrived, had started like any other. Eleanor had spent her morning in the garden, planting a new rose bush in honor of Thomas. It had been a tradition for the two of them to plant a rose for every year they had been married. But since his death, she had continued the ritual alone. As the sky grew overcast, the clouds darkened, and Eleanor had retreated inside, prepared to spend the afternoon reading. The knocking at her door, unexpected and urgent, had been the first sign that something was about to change, something far beyond her understanding. As she opened the door to the twins, Eleanor's mind raced with questions. Who were they? How did they know about Ethan? And why did they seem to hold such a heavy burden in their eyes? The girl's words were barely audible as she whispered, "Please, Mom, we need to talk to you. It's about your son." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. The years of unanswered calls, of wondering what had become of Ethan, flooded back to her in an overwhelming rush. Was this the moment she had been waiting for? Was this the sign that he had finally come home? Or was it something far darker? The twins' presence, so out of place, felt like the beginning of a story she had never imagined. She stepped aside, her mind whirling with possibilities, her body weighed down by an unshakable sense of dread. She wasn't prepared for what they would reveal, but deep down, Eleanor knew that her life, the quiet, empty life she had been living, was about to be shattered. And whatever truth these children carried, it was far more than she could have ever anticipated. The twins stepped into Eleanor's living room with an air of unease, their presence unsettling in a way that Eleanor couldn't quite place. They were both around 10 years old, a boy and a girl, dressed in simple, mismatched clothing that spoke of days spent running barefoot through the streets, or possibly, much more ominously, running from something. Their faces were drawn, their eyes wide and unnervingly intense. But it wasn't just their gaze that unsettled her. It was the unspoken weight that seemed to hang between them, an invisible barrier of pain and urgency. Eleanor shut the door behind them, though her instincts screamed at her to turn and flee. She had never been one for confrontation, never imagined herself caught in the middle of anything sinister. Her world had always been small and simple. Yet here she was, standing in the midst of a brewing storm, caught between two children who knew something about her son, something they were not prepared to share without first offering their own silent confession. The girl, a frail thing with short, mousy brown hair and a look that seemed too old for her age, hesitated as she took in Eleanor's home. Her eyes darted to the pictures on the wall, photos of happier times, of Thomas, of Emily, of Ethan, laughing together on family vacations. For a moment, Eleanor wondered if the child even understood what she was looking at, or if she even cared. It seemed like she did. "Do you know Ethan Carter?" the boy asked, his voice steady but quiet. He was the taller of the two, with a mop of black hair that fell into his eyes. His expression was calm, but there was a quiet intensity about him, as if he had seen too much for a child his age. Eleanor's heart lurched. "Ethan? Yes, he's my son." She gestured toward the couch, silently inviting them to sit. She felt a flicker of relief, thinking that perhaps these children had simply come to talk, to explain why they had come to her door. But the relief was fleeting, slipping away like sand between her fingers. The boy, whose name Eleanor would later learn was Marcus, looked at his sister before speaking again. "We need to tell you something. It's about Ethan. Something bad." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, waiting to burst. "Bad," Eleanor repeated, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean? Where is he? Why hasn't he called me? Why hasn't he been home?" The flood of questions she'd buried deep inside her heart suddenly poured out, urgent and raw. The girl, whose name was Mia, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She seemed to be the more fragile of the two, her hands trembling slightly as they twisted in her lap. It was clear that whatever she had to say was not something she wanted to reveal. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Finally, she whispered, "He's in trouble, Ma'am. Bad trouble. We've been trying to help him, but he doesn't want us to." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She felt the room closing in on her, the walls pressing against her chest, as if the air itself had thickened. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, her voice shaky now. She couldn't help it. Fear was taking root deep inside her. The possibility of something happening to Ethan, something she had never once considered, began to feel real. Mia shifted again, glancing nervously at her brother before finally speaking. "Ethan, he's in danger. He got involved with people who are bad, really bad. He owes them something." Her words were slow and careful, as if she was afraid of saying too much, but also too terrified to keep quiet. Who? Eleanor asked, though she already feared the answer. She had heard rumors over the years, whispers about Ethan's behavior in the few calls and letters she had received. Nothing specific, just vague references to bad crowds and wrong turns. But this was different. There was something in Mia's eyes, something in Marcus's expression, that told her this wasn't just teenage rebellion. This was darker. The people who hurt him, Marcus said, his voice tight, filled with a strange mix of anger and pity. He glanced at Mia, as though ensuring she was okay to continue. Mia nodded, though her face was pale and drawn. They've been after him for weeks now. He ran away, and we tried to find him. He asked us to come and tell you everything. He wanted you to know what happened, but he's too scared to face you himself. Eleanor felt a deep, hollow ache in her chest. Her son was afraid of something so terrible that he couldn't even bring himself to ask her for help. The mother in her screamed for him, begged the universe to give her back the boy she had once known. But there was no time for those thoughts now. There was only the cold truth of their words, and the growing realization that something was very wrong. Eleanor leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the coffee table as she looked into the children's eyes. What happened? What kind of people is he involved with? Where is he now? Marcus exhaled slowly, his brow furrowed with a mix of frustration and sadness. He won't say. He won't tell us, but we know it's bad. These people, they want him to do something illegal. They've threatened him. He's running from them, but he can't run forever. We were supposed to bring you to him. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. The air around her seemed to thicken as the weight of the situation settled in. Her son was not only missing, he was in trouble, real trouble, with dangerous people who could hurt him. He wasn't just lost or disoriented. He was actively hiding from forces she couldn't begin to understand. Where is he now? She asked again, her voice barely more than a whisper. The twins exchanged a look, their faces tense with unspoken fear. We don't know, Mia said, but we think he's in the old factory on Elm Street, the one that's been abandoned for years. It's the last place we saw him. He didn't want us to go with him. He said it was too dangerous, but we couldn't leave him alone. Eleanor felt her heart racing. The factory, she knew it. It had been shut down years ago, a crumbling shell of what it once was. The rumors about that place were enough to send chills down anyone's spine. It was the perfect place for someone to hide. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that if Ethan was there, he wasn't just hiding. He was trapped. Eleanor rose to her feet, a sudden determination surging through her veins. We're going there? Now? The twins looked at her with a mixture of surprise and caution, but there was no time for hesitation. If there was a chance to find Ethan, to save him from whatever nightmare he had walked into, she would take it. With no more words, the three of them hurried out the door, their steps quick and anxious. The rain had begun to fall in thick sheets, but Eleanor barely noticed. Her mind was focused on one thing: finding her son. As they neared the abandoned factory, the wind howled and the streets seemed to empty, as if the world was holding its breath. The darkness pressed in on them, and Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The factory loomed ahead, an ominous silhouette against the stormy night sky. There was no turning back now. The storm was upon them, both in the world around them and in the secret world Ethan had found himself trapped in. As they approached the factory, the tension between them mounted. There was no sign of Ethan, no sign of life at all, except for the eerie silence that filled the air. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she took another step forward. She didn't know what awaited her inside, but she would face it, whatever it was, head on. The door to the factory creaked open, and the darkness seemed to swallow them whole. The factory's steel door groaned as it swung open, revealing an overwhelming darkness inside. Eleanor squinted, trying to adjust to the dim light filtering in through the broken windows, the rain pelting the glass like a barrage of bullets. The twins moved quickly ahead of her, their small silhouettes barely visible in the shadows, but they didn't seem scared. It was as if they were accustomed to this place, this world of hidden danger, of people who were beyond saving. Eleanor, on the other hand, felt every inch of unease press against her skin, but there was no turning back. Ethan was somewhere in this labyrinth of decay and forgotten memories, and she was going to find him. "We're close," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. The girl had led them through a maze of dark hallways, past rusted machinery and crumbling support beams. The deeper they went into the factory, the more isolated it felt, the silence growing heavy. Eleanor's heart raced in her chest, her pulse quickening with every step. Suddenly, Marcus stopped dead in his tracks, his body stiffening as his eyes scanned the darkness ahead. Mia, who had been walking just behind him, froze as well. Eleanor instinctively took a step forward, her senses on high alert. Something wasn't right. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "Shh," Marcus hissed, his eyes locked on a shadow at the end of the hallway. For a moment, Eleanor saw nothing but the blackness, the dilapidated walls standing like sentinels, waiting. And then the sound, a low guttural groan that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't human, not entirely. Before Eleanor could react, the noise came again, louder, clearer this time, a terrifying mix of frustration and pain. And then she saw him, Ethan, but it wasn't the Ethan she remembered. There he was, slumped against a rusted pillar, his face pale and gaunt, his clothes torn and soaked through with blood. His eyes were wide, glassy, unfocused. He didn't seem to recognize her at first, and then, when he finally turned to face her, his expression was filled with terror, not the relief she'd expected. "Ethan!" Eleanor cried, rushing toward him. But as she moved closer, her heart stopped cold. He was not alone. Emerging from the shadows behind him was a figure Eleanor had never expected to see, a man she thought had been long gone from their lives, a man who had been a friend, a mentor, a seemingly kind-hearted figure in the community. But the man standing there now was not the person she had known. His face, once warm and familiar, was twisted into something unrecognizable, a mask of cold determination and malice. "Greg?" Eleanor's voice trembled. "What are you doing here?" Greg, the once trusted family friend, just smiled. A cold, knowing smile that sent a wave of ice through Eleanor's veins. He was the last person she had ever imagined would be involved in something so dark, so dangerous. But here he was, standing in the heart of this decaying factory, his hands clenched into fists, his posture tense, as if ready to strike. "I didn't want to do this," Greg said, his voice low and grating. "But you wouldn't listen. None of you would listen." Eleanor felt a wave of confusion wash over her. "What are you talking about? Greg, this isn't you. Where's Ethan? What have you done to him?" Greg's lips curled into a mocking grin. "Oh, I haven't done anything. Ethan did it to himself. He's in this mess because of his own choices. I tried to warn him, but he didn't want to listen. He never listens. Eleanor took another step toward her son, but Greg blocked her path, his hand raised to stop her. His eyes gleamed with something dark, something sinister. You shouldn't be here, Eleanor. You don't understand what's going on. You don't understand what's at stake. Eleanor's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of their history. Greg had been a mentor to Ethan once, always around, always offering guidance. He had been there when things had gotten tough, when Ethan had struggled with his personal demons. But this man, this version of Greg, felt like a stranger. Her breath quickened. Something had changed in him. Something had warped his morality, twisted him into something she couldn't recognize. Greg, please. This isn't you, she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. What's happening? What are you involved in? For a moment his expression softened, and Eleanor thought, just for a fleeting second, that she might reach him. But the look was fleeting, replaced again by cold indifference. He wasn't just an observer in this story. He was a key player, a puppet master. I was just doing my job, Greg said slowly, almost regretfully. Someone has to keep control. Someone has to clean up the mess. And your son, he's the mess I'm cleaning up. His tone was detached, matter of fact, as if this was a normal part of life. A cold dread settled over Eleanor as she pieced together his words. Clean up the mess, she repeated. What are you talking about? What mess? Greg stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Ethan got too deep. He started making deals with the wrong people, people you don't want to mess with. I gave him an out. I offered him a way out, but he didn't take it. He paused, his eyes narrowing. Now it's too late. You can't save him. You can't stop what's coming. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. Greg wasn't trying to help Ethan. He wasn't trying to save him. He was the one who had pushed him further down this path, who had made sure Ethan was trapped in the web of dangerous individuals. He wasn't a mentor, he was a handler. And all of this, every horrible decision, had led to this moment, to this horrifying truth. Greg, stop, Eleanor cried, her heart pounding in her chest. Please, let him go. He's just a kid. This has nothing to do with him. Greg's expression flickered for a moment, but then it hardened again. You should have kept him away from all of this. But it's too late now. There's no going back. Your son is mine now. He's in too deep to walk away. Just as the words left his mouth, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, approaching rapidly. Eleanor turned instinctively, her heart leaping in her throat. More figures emerged from the shadows, more people she never expected to see. Some were familiar faces, others strangers. All of them shared the same predatory energy, the same aura of threat that hung in the air like a cloud of smoke. Eleanor's world tilted, the ground beneath her feet shaking with the realization that this wasn't just about Ethan anymore. This was bigger than anything she could have imagined. There was no simple solution, no quick escape. She was trapped in a nightmare, and the only way out was through a maze of lies, betrayal, and corruption. The stakes had just been raised higher than she ever thought possible. The only question now was how far she was willing to go to save her son, and whether there was anyone left to save. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Eleanor stood at the center of the factory's darkened hall, her heart pounding as she tried to process the whirlwind of revelations. Every word Greg had spoken, every truth he had unearthed about her son, felt like a slap to the face. The walls of this industrial graveyard seemed to close in on her, and yet she couldn't look away from Ethan's broken form, barely able to hold himself upright. His once sharp eyes now dulled with fear and confusion. Eleanor's mind raced as she tried to piece together the mess she was now trapped in. The fact that Greg had manipulated Ethan, lured him into this world of criminals and corruption, was almost too much to bear. But it wasn't just the pain of betrayal she had to contend with. No, the stakes had become even higher now, far higher than she had ever anticipated. Greg's eyes gleamed, a sinister glint reflecting the dim light from the factory's broken windows. His hands were shaking, but Eleanor could see the twisted glee in his expression. He was relishing this moment, savoring every bit of power he wielded. "You've lost, Eleanor," Greg said, his voice icy and final. "This isn't about saving your son anymore. You should have stayed away from all of this. But now, you're in it. You're both in too deep." Eleanor's gaze shifted from Greg to Ethan, whose fragile form was beginning to slump again. She couldn't let him fall. Not now. Not after everything they had fought through to get here. She took a step forward, heart in her throat. "No," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I haven't lost. You might have been controlling the game, but I won't let you win this." The words felt like they were leaving her body of their own accord, her mind still trying to catch up with her heart. She took another step forward, her legs shaking, but her resolve firm. Greg's grin grew wider, almost predatory. "You think you can stop this? You think you can change what's already been set in motion? Ethan's already made his choices. He's already paid the price." Eleanor's stomach churned at the implications of his words, but she wasn't about to let him break her. She couldn't lose Ethan to this man, to this monstrous world he had dragged them into. "You're wrong," she said, her voice growing stronger with every syllable. "My son is not lost. You've poisoned his mind, but I can still save him. And I'll do whatever it takes to pull him out of this." Greg's eyes narrowed, the mask of confidence starting to crack, but he remained defiant. "Save him? There's nothing left to save. You can't just erase all the damage that's been done." Eleanor's hand trembled as it reached out toward Ethan, her fingers brushing against his cold, clammy skin. His head lolled weakly in her direction, and for a moment his eyes met hers. There was a flicker of recognition there, a momentary glimmer of the son she remembered, before the darkness had consumed him. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking, "listen to me. You are still my son. You are not the man they want you to be. You're better than this. We can get out of here. We can fight back." Her words hung in the air like a lifeline, reaching across the chasm that had formed between them. Ethan's lips parted, a faint agonized sound escaping them, as if he were fighting to speak. He swallowed hard, his eyes dull, but full of emotion. "Mom," he croaked, the word barely a whisper. I can't." "Don't say that," Eleanor urged, her heart aching with every breath she took. "You can. We're stronger than this, Ethan. Don't let him control you." But Greg was quick to intervene, stepping forward and blocking her view of her son. His face was now flushed with anger, the mask of calm falling away to reveal the monster underneath. "You don't get it, Eleanor. It's already too late. He belongs to me now. And you're just another pawn in this game. You think you can stop me? You're out of your depth." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The fire inside her surged, burning away her fear. She had come too far to back down now. "I won't let you take him," she spat, her eyes locked onto Greg's. "I will fight until my last breath. He's my son, and nothing you do, can change that." The words, sharp as knives, struck Greg hard. For a brief moment, the confidence wavered in his eyes. Eleanor could see his frustration, his grip on the situation slipping just slightly. The longer they stood there, the more he seemed to realize that his control over this situation was fragile, that Eleanor's defiance could topple everything. Greg's fist clenched and his jaw tightened. "You think you can stand up to me? You're nothing compared to what I've been through. I've already won. You're already too late." With a feral growl, he lunged toward Eleanor, his hands reaching for her throat. The move was swift, too fast for her to react. But just as his fingers brushed against her skin, something shifted. Ethan, through sheer will, pushed himself upright, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. But his eyes blazed with clarity for the first time in what felt like forever. "No!" Ethan cried out, his voice hoarse and filled with a raw desperation. "Mom, get away from him!" Eleanor's heart leapt in her chest as she saw the change in her son. For the first time, he wasn't the fragile, broken boy who had been consumed by fear and manipulation. There was fire in his eyes, fire that came from the love they had shared, from the bond they had always had, a bond that Greg could never destroy. With everything he had, Ethan threw himself between Eleanor and Greg, knocking the older man off balance. Greg staggered back, surprised by Ethan's sudden burst of strength. And for the first time, Eleanor saw the fear in Greg's eyes. He wasn't the one in control anymore. "Get away from my mother!" Ethan shouted, his voice filled with the strength of 1,000 lifetimes. Greg's eyes blazed with rage, but the shock of Ethan's defiance momentarily disarmed him. The factory, once a tomb of despair, now felt alive with the thrum of battle, of defiance, of hope, pushing back against the darkness. In that moment, Eleanor saw it, the turning point. Ethan had found his way back to her. She had reached him. Together, they would fight. They would win. With one last furious roar, Greg lunged again, but this time, Eleanor was ready. She stepped back, grabbing a rusty metal pipe from the ground, and with all her might, swung it toward him. The impact sent him crashing to the floor, his face a mask of disbelief. "You lost, Greg," Eleanor said, her voice cold and final. "And I won." Ethan collapsed to the ground beside her, breathing heavily, but the fight in him had returned. He was still her son, and together they were unstoppable. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, a sign of the law closing in on them. But for now, they had won. The factory that had been a symbol of their torment was now the place of their redemption. And as they stood together, looking down at the defeated Greg, they knew that this was just the beginning of their journey, one they would take side by side. The air had a newfound clarity, as though the weight of the past months, even years, had been lifted. The sun, low in the sky, cast a soft golden hue over the factory grounds, transforming the scene from one of chaos to an oddly serene tableau. Eleanor and Ethan stood at the edge of the factory lot, breathing in the cool air as the sound of distant sirens grew louder, signaling the end of Greg's reign and the beginning of their new chapter. Eleanor's hands trembled as she held her son, the same hands that had once been so full of fear and uncertainty, now brimming with a quiet strength. Her eyes searched Ethan's face, taking in the exhaustion, the remnants of the bruises, but also the spark of something that had been lost for so long: hope. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed from the tears that had fallen earlier. But there was no longer any trace of the boy who had been controlled by fear, by manipulation. There was a new resolve in him now, a quiet confidence, like he had finally stepped into the person he was always meant to be. He was still her son, but he was different, stronger, wiser, and most importantly, free. "Mum," he said, his voice still rough but steady, I'm sorry for everything. I should have listened to you sooner." Eleanor's heart ached at the words, but there was no anger in her. There was only love, deep and unyielding. She pulled him into a hug, the embrace a silent acknowledgement of all they had been through, and all they had overcome. "You don't need to apologize, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We've both been through a lot. The important thing is, we're here now, together." The relief was palpable, but the weight of what had transpired still lingered. Greg was in the hands of the authorities now, and the truth of everything that had happened was slowly coming to light. Eleanor had feared that this would break her, break them, but in the end, it had done the opposite. It had forged something even stronger, a bond unshakable by anyone or anything. As the last of the police cars disappeared into the distance, heading off to take Greg to where he would face justice, the reality of their situation settled in. It was over. The nightmare was finally finished. The fight for Ethan's future had been won, not through force, but through love, resilience, and a steadfast refusal to let go. Eleanor knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be difficult days, painful moments where the scars of the past would resurface. But she was no longer afraid. Neither of them were. The journey they had taken together had shown them that they were stronger than they had ever imagined, capable of standing tall even when the world seemed to have turned its back. As the days passed and the dust began to settle, Eleanor and Ethan found themselves in a new chapter of their lives, one that was filled with uncertainty, but also endless possibilities. For the first time in a long while, they found peace in the small moments. A quiet dinner at home, the sound of laughter filling the air, the simple joy of spending time together, without the shadow of fear hanging over them. Ethan, once lost and trapped in a world of lies and manipulation, had begun rebuilding his life. He enrolled in therapy to deal with the trauma, and slowly he started to rebuild the relationships he had once torn apart. The road to healing would be long, but he was no longer walking it alone. He had his mother, his strongest ally, and together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. Eleanor, too, had undergone a transformation. The woman who had walked into that factory so many weeks ago, broken and defeated, was no longer the same person. She had found strength in the fight, in her ability to protect her son, and in her unwavering belief that love was the most powerful force in the world. It was a lesson she had always known deep down, but now it had become her truth, her guiding light. As she stood on the balcony of their new home, a small, modest place they had found together, far from the dark memories of the factory, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of reflection. They had come through the storm. She had come through the storm. And she had learned that no matter what, the most important thing in life was not what you had or where you were, but the people you fought for and the strength you found in each other. The moral of their journey was clear. and it was one Eleanor carried with her every day. Never underestimate the power of love, resilience, and the will to fight for what matters most. It was easy to feel powerless in the face of overwhelming odds, to believe that the weight of the world was too much to bear. But Eleanor's story, her and Ethan's story, was a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. There is always the possibility of redemption. No matter how far you've fallen, no matter how broken you feel, you can always rise again. And that was the greatest lesson of all. No matter how long the night, the dawn will always come. The most important thing is to keep moving forward, to keep fighting, and to never give up on the people you love, or on yourself. In the end, Eleanor realized that the strength to overcome any obstacle came not from power, but from the heart, and no one could ever take that away from her. As you reflect on Eleanor and Ethan's journey, ask yourself, what would you have done if you were in their shoes? Would you have had the strength to stand up to the dark forces that sought to control your life? Would you have been able to protect your loved ones, even when the world seemed to be falling apart? Eleanor's story is one of courage, resilience, and the power of love, a reminder that no matter how difficult life becomes, there is always hope, and there is always a way forward. But it also leaves us with a profound question. How far are we willing to go for the people we care about? What lengths would we take to ensure their safety and happiness? If you were moved by this story, share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear your reflections on the choices Eleanor made and how you would handle such a challenge in your own life. What would you have done differently? And if you found this tale inspiring or thought-provoking, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can join us for more stories that stir the heart and challenge the mind. Share this video with friends or family who might need a dose of inspiration. And let's continue exploring these powerful, life-changing narratives together. Remember, every story has the potential to inspire change. Let's make sure we spread these messages far and wide. Join the conversation today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.